I'm going to hand over now to Steve Unger, who I could introduce in many ways because he's got a lot of different heads and hats. But he's the head of the UK chapter of the IIC, as well as a former Ofcom board member and a specialty partner at consultancy Flint Global. And he will chair a panel, which is a bit of a deep dive into one of the topics we've been discussing, which is that of competition and particularly global perspectives on platform competition. Over to you, Steve.
So thanks very much, Monica, for that introduction. As Monica noted, this session is covering digital competition in digital markets. I've got 5 great panelists. Can I say before I start that we'd welcome questions from the audience. If you think of questions while the speakers are talking, pop them in the Q&A box and I'll make sure I spot them, and if we have time, ask them at the end. So to start with, can I introduce Gerard de Graaf, who is titled Director for Digital Transformation in DG Connect in the European Commission. I think more specifically, he's the person who's been shepherding the Digital Markets Act through the legislative process. So I'd like to hand over to Gerard to talk a bit about that process, where we are now, and provide some description of what that framework looks like for our global audience. Over to you, Gerard.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. I mean, I've not yet been described as a shepherd of the Digital Markets Act, but I'm happy to adopt that title. Let me say a few things also for the audience that may not be as familiar with the Digital Markets Act, which is currently under negotiation in the European Union between the co-legislators, the Council of Ministers and the European Parliament. I want to say by something first very positive about platforms, because otherwise you get the impression that we see platforms only as sources of problems, but we see platforms as sources of innovation, as of course to allow us to connect. Also for many small businesses in the European Union to be able to use platforms allows them to serve a much wider group of consumers across different member states. So I mean, just as a kind of an opening remark, platforms do great things, and I think we all rely on them. But we're also quite familiar with, of course, say almost the economics of the platform economy, which is that the network effects, the economies of scale and scope are such that some grow into really very, very large online platforms that can come to basically govern or set the rules for an entire ecosystem. And I think we're all also familiar with that. I mean, we use those services as well, whether it's marketplaces, whether it's app stores, whether it's other intermediary services. And there, I mean, we have come to the conclusion that it's a pretty bold statement that competition policy, competition rules are no longer enough to ensure that these markets are fair and contestable. That competitors have a chance to come in and compete on fair terms and dislodge the position of these very large platforms. And so what the EU has done, and I think we're probably the first in the world here, is to come forward with an ex ante intervention, an intervention which in our jargon is based on internal market logic. We have a treaty base which is 114. So these are rules which, once they are adopted in the European Union, will apply directly. So this is not where a competition authority has to kind of build a case, do a large investigation and say, look, this is unfair, you are abusing a dominant position and therefore for you this is the kind of remedy. Now these are rules that apply to a designated group of gatekeepers. So how will the Digital Markets Act work? Well, first we identify a number of activities. We call these core platform services, which include marketplaces, app stores, I mean, the kind of intermediary two-sided market systems, but we also include cloud, we include messaging services. So those are core platform services. Then we have a set of criteria which would allow us to designate companies, very large platforms, as gatekeepers. These are quantitative criteria, so they actually, I mean, the gatekeepers themselves can confirm that they are indeed meeting these criteria. And then we also have a way to identify through a kind of a qualitative assessment gatekeeper. So, but the gatekeeper will know that they are within scope. The Commission, who will be the enforcer of this regulation, will set out quite clearly in decisions that the following companies are gatekeepers. We expect about, say, between 10 and 15 companies to qualify as gatekeepers. So what, if you are a gatekeeper, what does that mean? Well, there are a number of, as I said, obligations. We call them in our own kind of jargon, do's and don'ts, that we feel that these gatekeepers should comply with. And these are what we have defined, or at the political level, say, through the negotiation, we'll have defined as unfair practices. And then we're talking about self-preferencing. So you're competing like on a marketplace, you have third-party sellers, and you're using information about the third-party sellers to compete with them and in some ways undercut them. It is also restrictions on kind of access to data of like your own customers. It's tying offers, like you can only, if you can use this service, but then you have to use these other services as well. It's anti-steering, which we know also from, for example, the App Store. You cannot kind of recruit consumers outside of the App Store. So those are the type of practices you have to think about. And then there are also a number of do's, which are more like, well, how can we make sure that this market becomes more competitive? How can you ensure interoperability, access to data, so that others can come in and actually compete on more equal terms with these very large companies. So these are directly applicable obligations. So no efficiency defense. We can talk, particularly when it comes to interoperability. Well, how do you do it? What type of data, under which conditions? But it's an implementation discussion. It's not like, well, whether or not these obligations should apply. So then, I mean, so that's the kind of the essence of it. We also need, of course, to keep the instrument future-proof. So we have kind of investigations going on. Are there new gatekeepers, new practices, etc.? So that's something we will do. Companies, of course, are expected to comply. If they don't, there are serious consequences. I mean, there could be fines of up to 10% of global turnover. But if there's systemic non-compliance, then we can go as far as functional separation or structural separation. So in effect, breaking up that company. So that's in a nutshell where we are. We made the proposal last December, of course, following intensive preparations and public consultation and impact assessment. So it wasn't kind of overnight. We're moving forward very, very rapidly in the legislative process. And by the end of November, the Council and the Parliament will have established their positions, and then they will be ready to negotiate in what we call a trilogue between the Council and the Parliament, and then the Commission as an honest broker in between. I think it's realistic to expect this proposal to become law under the French presidency, which will kick in on the 1st of January. Then, of course, with a 6 months or 12 months period. So we're looking at, say, sometime in 2023 that this legislation will be law in the European Union. And it will have tremendous impact on these gatekeepers and on some practices. This is definitely landmark legislation. I mean, later on, maybe I can say something about the interactions which we have with third countries, but let me leave it here because there's a lot of other things to discuss. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks very much for that, Gerard. It's a very, very helpful summary of a very complex piece of legislation. So can I now turn to Will Hayter? Will is Senior Director of the Digital Markets Unit, which is, I think, in the process of being established in the UK's Competition and Markets Authority. I'm hoping he'll be able to talk about the process that is currently underway, the legislative process currently underway in the UK to create a regime for thinking about competition in digital markets. So over to you, Will.
Thanks, Steve, and thank you to you and the organisers for asking me to be part of this discussion. I think we could all agree there's no better time to be exchanging ideas internationally as governments and authorities around the world work out how to handle the market power challenges in these digital markets. Just briefly in terms of housekeeping, while I can give a reasonable CMA view, I certainly do not speak for the UK government, and it's the government that's just held a consultation on the new proposed framework, and we'll now be taking forward legislation when parliamentary time allows. We at the CMA and in the Shadow Digital Markets Unit are here to help by advising on the policy development and are obviously ready to implement whatever Parliament decides. I'll briefly summarise where the UK is on the journey and just try briefly to put it into the international context as well. So the background is well known, I think. As Gerard indicated, digital markets are particularly prone to market power for various reasons. And I would echo Gerard's opening positive comments, but the one-time scrappy upstarts have become hugely powerful incumbents in some cases, and competition law enforcement on its own is not sufficient to deal with the challenges they pose. Rather than dealing with conduct on a case-by-case basis after harm has occurred, a new pro-competitive solution is needed to set the rules of the game in advance and to promote more vibrant competition and innovation in these markets. And that's what the proposals here aim to do. So the new regime would apply only to the most powerful digital firms, those we identify as having strategic market status in a particular activity. And for firms that meet that test, there would be three key pillars to the regime. First, an enforceable code of conduct which would set the rules of the game and aim to prevent firms taking advantage of their powerful position, whether that's by exploiting consumers or businesses or by excluding competitors. The second piece is pro-competitive interventions. Those could be data access remedies, various types of consumer choice remedy, interoperability, various forms of separation potentially. And these remedies would be aimed at addressing the roots of the firm's powerful positions and trying to promote greater contestability and competition in the market. And lastly, a specific SMS firm merger regime designed to allow closer scrutiny of acquisitions by firms with the strategic market status. And we've put forward a set of 5 principles for how the new framework should operate. First, it has to be evidence-driven and effective. Any regulation obviously has to be effective, and that means in this case ensuring not just that it's evidence-based, but that it can react swiftly enough to prevent and address harms. The activities undertaken by the most powerful firms are very diverse, and a one-size-fits-all approach we think could have damaging results, so the need to target specifically at particular activities. It has to be proportionate and targeted at addressing a particular problem and minimising the risk of any unintended consequences. We think it's really important that it's proactive and forward-looking. So that means trying to prevent harm from occurring rather than enforcing after the fact. So we should be seeking to try and understand how digital markets might evolve, the risks that evolution poses to competition and innovation, and to try to act proactively to assess and manage those risks. It should be coherent. So we should be seeking to promote coherence with other regulatory regimes, both domestically and internationally. You heard about the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum from Melanie in the previous session, and I think we're going to talk more about the international aspect of this in this session, but both are really important. Finally, we think the new framework has to be characterized by being open, transparent, and accountable. Across all of our work, the DMU should operate in an open and transparent manner. It needs to consult a wide range of parties. It should very clearly articulate why it's reached decisions and be held accountable for them. And this last principle, you might say, is just good regulatory practice, and to an extent you'd be right. But both we and the Furman report have put particular emphasis on this through the idea of so-called participative regulation. And what that means is working closely with all parties with an interest to ensure that solutions can be found as fast as possible, given the speed at which these markets change and develop. So as I said, just to reflect briefly on the international context, I think this is the first time in history that authorities around the world are looking at a similar set of companies doing fairly similar things in many markets around the world at the same time. And we're all facing up in slightly different ways to these new challenges. Each country or administration authority is trying to find the right balance between various trade-offs, whether that's administrability versus targeting or specificity, whether it's flexibility versus certainty, or whether it's speed versus way to process. And we're all trying to tackle the same problems, but are doing so in ways that reflect our respective backgrounds and context. And that includes the nature of the legislative process, our constitutional arrangements, and our respective histories of regulation. So for our part, we are doing our very best to draw on all the lessons we've learned from other regulatory systems in the UK, such as telecoms or financial services or groceries or elsewhere. But we will also learn an awful lot from each other across national boundaries in the coming months and years, and I look forward to that very much. Thanks, Steve. I'll hand back to you.
Thanks very much, Will. A very helpful introduction, and I appreciate the caveats that, of course, the UK government hasn't quite finally decided what to do, but it's very helpful to understand where the CMA is coming from. So I'd now like to cross the Atlantic and ask Rob Atkinson to speak. Rob is the founder and president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. That's a policy think tank in Washington, DC. He's also the author of a number of books on innovation tech policy, including one called Big is Beautiful, Debunking the Myth of Small Business. What I've asked Rob to do is actually two different things. I've asked him to talk a bit about the emerging policy agenda in the US from the new Biden administration, to the extent that it's possible to work out exactly what that is. I've also asked him to give a personal perspective on the nature of the debate that's playing out in the US at the moment. Thank you very much. Over to you, Rob.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Steve. It's a pleasure to be with you. A great discussion so far. So I think a way to understand what's going on in US policy with regard to what we would call antitrust, and then specifically with regard to platforms, is that the Biden administration is really an administration where it has to satisfy two different forces. There's more the moderate wing of the Democratic Party, and there's more the progressive or populist wing. The populist and progressive wing is much more liberal, much more progressive, much more anti-corporate than they were 10 years ago. And one of the ways he's mollified that wing is to give them a lot of control over antitrust. This was the reason he put Tim Wu in the White House in competition policy. This is why he appointed Lena Khan to be head of the FTC. These are hardcore, what we would call neo-Brandeisians. They fundamentally do not like large corporations. And big tech, quote unquote, is really just this, beautiful target sitting right there in the middle for them to go after. So that, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't have any rules or whatever. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying you have to understand that the whole motivation of these folks is to really limit large corporations. That's what's happening. The House and the Senate are a little different. You have a pretty progressive member who's heading up the House Judiciary Subcommittee, Chairman David Cicilline from Rhode Island, Democrat. He is much more aligned, I would argue, with maybe where the Europeans are with regard to the DMA. Though nobody's going to call it the DMA here, but there's certainly talk about platform regulation specifically. And then in the Senate, you've got Amy Klobuchar heading up the Antitrust Judiciary Subcommittee. Very similar. She has a new book out, which I encourage you to look at, and very similar proposals. The difference between the US and Europe is that fundamentally we don't, at least until now, have not subscribed to the precautionary principle. We're much more about, well, let's see how things work out and see how it goes, and looking more at the risk of regulation. So it's not clear to me that first of all, they have a window of opportunity of probably 18 months, because it's certainly possible the Democrats will lose the House at least in 2022. So they've got to get a piece of legislation through that's that big in that amount of time is tough. And then in particular, they've got to get I just don't know how they get through the Senate because of the filibuster rule. So certainly the administration under the FTC and the new head of antitrust for DOJ will be much more aggressive and active. It's not clear how far they can go. They can bring some cases, but the Facebook case got thrown out. In regards to the sort of what my own opinion, what we should do here, I guess my overarching points are two. One is, there's very little, most of the focus is on what are the risks, what are the problems of platforms. And I hate the word gatekeeper. It's like, oh, we have a gate. It's like, I think that's a pejorative term. I don't think it's accurate. But the common view is what are the problems, why there are all these risks. But what's not really discussed is what's the risk on the other side of regulation. And in my view, the risks of over-regulation here are quite significant. If you look at these companies, just the Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Google, they spend more, and Microsoft, they spend more on R&D than the entire, essentially the same on R&D than the entire UK economy does every year, business and government combined. So they're this enormous engine of innovation. They spend they're doing exactly what commentators wanted in the US, to spend a boatload of money on R&D and think about the future. And that's what they're doing. So that's number one. Number two is, what's the real goal here? And in the US, the goal has always been the consumer welfare standard, not protecting businesses. And I worry that a lot of the focus in Europe is around protecting businesses. Like at one level, as long as it's legitimate competition. And by the way, I'm not advocating or supporting companies doing specifically unfair things or anti-competitive things. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying if they can beat another company or many, many companies, why would we care about that? I don't see the role of government as to be protecting competitors. Gerard used talking about self-preferencing, which to me is like everybody self-preferences. Why wouldn't you self-preference? And he used the term, they might use this information to undercut the competitor. Seems to me that's good. Isn't that exactly what we want? We want them to undercut the competitor with lower prices or more selection or higher quality. So, I just think we've got to really, really be careful about that. Again, look at a company like Tesco in the UK. They self-preference all the time. They favor their own products. They put them higher on the shelf, I assume. That's certainly what big grocery stores in the US do. They have a big market share, 28% of UK retail sales, more than many big platforms in the US have for their market share. They use data to advantage them. They can block competitors. So why are we talking about regulating, quote, digital gatekeepers and not analog gatekeepers? I think also Gerard mentioned that competition policy is insufficient to challenge their position. I don't think that should be the position of competition policy. I mean, it seems to me if that's the standard, then Europe has failed dismally. Daimler is still around. Why haven't they been disrupted? They've been around over 100 years. Volkswagen, 75, 80 years. Siemens, over 150 years. Volvo. Why are these companies still in existence? Why can't we use competition policy to destroy them? So again, I just don't think that that's really the focus. That should be the focus. Also, I think with platforms, there are a lot of, by the way, also, I think it's talking about platforms as sort of these unified things, I think it's quite misleading. There's at least three major kinds of platforms. There's sales platforms like Amazon. There's search platforms like Google, and there's sort of connection platforms like Facebook or TikTok or the like. And they operate very differently. There's different market conditions, there's different incentives. But overall, I think the incentives for platforms is generally to behave reasonably. And again, I'm not saying that every platform behaves perfectly. I'm not at all saying that. But what I'm saying is that the structure is to behave reasonably, principally because they're two-sided markets. If Amazon starts to go after too many of its sellers, third-party sellers, then there's fewer people go to the Amazon website, and then they lose. If Facebook starts to discriminate against certain types of users, then advertisers don't want to do it. The other sort of major worry I have about this is, I think you're all familiar with Alfred Chandler's work, famous, one of the greatest business historians of all time. And Chandler documented the rise of the multi-divisional industrial corporation after the 1890s. And that was, probably the most important business institution innovation in the last 150 years. That's what drove our prosperity. And I would argue that we're in potentially a similar place with the platformization of the economy. We could see platforms in finance. I mean, we talk about fintech, we talk about, really completely disrupting the banking and securities industry with fintech. Aren't we? To me, that should be a good thing. That's like a fantastic thing. Look at all the jobs. Look at all the consumer benefits. Look at all the productivity. So the last thing I'll just say is, I think a lot of the cases here that people talk about, self-preferencing, using data, those are all, quite legitimate things for companies to do. The real issue is, for example, if Amazon were to, discriminate against a company and say, you can't sell on us because of a certain reason, to me, they just need to be transparent about that. But there's no reason Amazon has to allow every retailer to sell on its platform. It's their platform. There's other opportunities for companies. Same thing with Google. When I use Google and I put in an address, the first thing that pops up is Google Maps. I'm really happy about that because it saves me one click to go somewhere else. Now, Google doesn't pretend that it's, hey, we're secretly putting this in as an organic result. They're very clear about that. It's not an organic result. But why would we want to ban that? Because it clearly makes consumers' lives easier. And that's, to me, what the whole point is about. So again, I would go back, I would caution us in terms of, there's certain areas of the DMA I think that are worth looking at, but I think there are others that are probably end up going to be hurting innovation and consumer welfare. So thank you.
So thanks very much, Rob. I'm fascinated by the slightly different perspectives from the US and Europe. I'm currently including the UK and in Europe. I'd like to come back to the question of how much common ground there is, but I'll do that after our next couple of speakers. So can I now introduce Andrea Antooka? She's a consultant at Auxera. She's also the winner of the IIC's Future Leaders competition for 2001. Having written a fascinating piece on the principles that should guide policymakers looking at internet intermediaries. And that piece is available on the IIC website. I'd encourage you to take a look. And over to you, Andrea.
Thank you. And I'm very honored to receive this prize, because I think the topic of this year's competition is highly important for policymakers across the world, as they are looking at increasing the responsibilities of the online intermediaries. And this has an effect on their services directly, but also on the competition landscape in which they find themselves. I'm gonna switch a little bit the focus of the discussion, because the core theme of my paper was this idea of trade-offs being present when intervening with new rules. So I will start from here, give you a very quick overview of what the paper was about, and then I'm gonna round back to how this is relevant to competition and to policymakers thinking of intervening to preserve competition. All of the views that I'm going to express are my own, independent of the work that I do at Auxera. So content moderation is without doubt a very broad topic without having very clear right and wrongs. Certain things can be seen as funny in someone's view, while someone else can look at them as being illegal. But the reality is these platforms over which this content is being carried affect a lot of our lives. Some platforms have more than 2 billion active users, which means that they touch on the lives of more people than an individual country touches on. So is this central role that they have, which can create great benefits by connecting us with the right type of content, with the right type of connections, but can also amplify harms such as illegal content, such as hateful speech or misinformation being spread until it becomes viral. In the paper, I do look at how policymakers can start thinking of intervening in this space, and I draw attention to the fact that there is a trade-off between 4 different aims, and these 4 aims are as follows. First of all, they want to have an efficient legal system that provides clarity so that the different platforms know what are the rules. At the same time, they need to prevent harms. They need to prevent those types of content that I was just discussing. But any content also interacts with our freedom of expression and our fundamental rights, which is the third aim that they need to achieve through their intervention. And finally, they need to keep an eye out on encouraging economic growth and innovation more widely. So there's a very broad remit for the work that they have to do and the balance that they need to keep in mind when designing new rules. So the paper puts forward 7 guiding principles, and they are informed by what currently happens in certain countries, as well as what are the proposals being put forward in different countries for more intervention. And 2 of the first principles, intermediary liability and no general monitoring, are to some degree already present across the world. There are some differences, but in general, there is an agreement that platforms should have some flexibility in developing their activities without being afraid that they will be held responsible for everything that is on their platform. And also, no one really wants them to check absolutely everything that goes online, because that comes with another host of issues. But we're hearing more and more that this is not sufficient, and more responsibility is being demanded from online platforms, in which case there is a need for additional obligations and requirements. And I argue that this should be governed by the principle of proportionality. And I think we've heard this earlier in this panel as well, that not every business poses the same type of risk. So this should be accounted by the policymakers. And this goes hand in hand as well with what are they aiming to change. And I'm arguing that it should be governed by the principle of targeting processes and not outcomes, because otherwise the new rules that are being implemented, if they pinpoint the specific outcomes, can become outdated very quickly. And the sixth and the seventh principles that I put forward in the paper are collaboration and transparency, with the safeguard of users. Sorry, I skipped that one. But collaboration is key in here. And we've heard in the previous panel as well how different organizations across the world are trying to communicate and try to find support both within and outside their country, because they're looking at similar type of issues. And this is not valid only for content moderation, but also applies to other aspects of digital platforms, such as competition. And if I am to apply a similar thinking as I've done for content moderation for competition, there is one clear trade-off that I see in some of the proposals that have been put forward, and I've been following closely the UK and the EU ones. And I think there is a trade-off between the speed of intervention and the flexibility that their proposed system wants to introduce. And to some degree, this relates with the complexity that they are trying to address. We were talking earlier about gatekeepers or the firms with a significant market status, and they are important because they have a very precise place in our life that can enable both harms and benefits. But because they are at the core, they can sometimes abuse their position. And I highlight that it's only in certain cases, which should be addressed. If the conditions are right, then policymakers should intervene. And this brings up the question on when is it right to intervene, coming back to the trade-off of flexibility versus speed. In my opinion, the UK has opted for a more flexible approach where there is more space for analysis and engagement with the firms, while the EU has opted for a more restrictive approach, more speedy with strict requirements and more quantitative approach of designating the firms that fall under it. So I will be very interested to see how this evolves throughout the legislative process, and if there will be more convergence between the UK and the EU, and also if they will influence in any way other parts of the world that are also looking at platform competition.
That's marvelous. Thank you, Andrea. So I'd now like to introduce my final panelist. That's Mark Williams, who's a practice manager, global knowledge and expertise for digital development at the World Bank. I've asked Mark to broaden out discussion slightly further beyond Europe and the US to try and give a perspective on how the developing world especially is thinking about these sorts of things, obviously accepting that's a very broad brief, but over to Mark to hear for him.
Thanks, Steve. And actually, on that point, I'm going to start off by saying, well, what are we talking about? What am I talking about when I refer to developing countries? And the answer, I mean, it's really the whole of the rest of the world. And that includes an incredibly broad spectrum of countries, ranging at the bottom from, extremely low income post-conflict countries, all the way through up to the middle income giants, including China, India, other Latin American countries. So I'm going to make some pretty broad generalizations here, and they're going to be, and I have to excuse that, but if we're going to do this in 10 minutes or less, I'm afraid it's inevitable. So that was the first point. The other point is that, why, what's the relevance between what's going on in developing countries, or what policymakers are thinking in developing countries, and what we've just been hearing about Europe and the US? And the answer is there is a long tradition, especially in digital markets, going back 30 years, of developing world looking to Europe for ex-ante inspiration on ex-ante regulatory framework. And many developing countries, the majority of them, have a telecoms regulatory framework that looks very similar to the European one. And then on antitrust and competition, the similar process happens, I mean, both from the US and from Europe. And so the rest of the world is looking at Europe and the US, and watching the debate and the legislation develop, and the approach of the regulators, and actively thinking about how that could be applied in developing countries. So in addition to that, the presence of platforms in developing countries is very visible, especially the big global tech companies, and it is a feature of the political landscape. And I'm going to, what I'm going to say in the next few minutes, I'm actually going to explain why I think it's a bit different, but they're still very visible in developing countries. So you take these things together, the importance of big tech and platforms in politics and on the political and regulatory agenda in developing countries, and the current evolutionary stage of this regulatory approaches in Europe and the US. And it is a very important issue in developing countries. I would say there is zero consensus across developing countries on what should be done about it. Some countries the majority of countries have done nothing. There are some countries that are moving ahead or moved ahead. And I would say in that group, there's some special cases. So China is the obvious one, which has taken dramatic action over the last couple of years around large tech digital companies, including the platform companies. And you also see regulatory action in India, South Africa. So there's a few countries that have taken some initiatives, but the majority of developing countries are not close to it. So what I'm going to say with all of that preamble, what I'm going to say is I'm actually going to talk a bit about ways in which the role of digital platforms in developing countries could be different from what we see in Europe and the US. And then following that, why we might think a different policy response is warranted in those countries. So on the differences, I think I'm just going to map out a few sort of basic facts of digital life in developing countries. And again, with my caveat that we've got a huge range of countries within that category. But in the majority of developing countries, and definitely true in the bottom half in terms of income, internet use is still very low. In sub-Saharan Africa, less than a quarter of the population regularly use the internet. Actually, a greater proportion of that have got access to it, physical access, so they live within broadband mobile networks, but less than a quarter of them actively use it. So the role of digital in daily life, both economic activity and personal life and in government, is just much more reduced in the majority of developing countries than it is in Europe, in the US. So that's one significant factor when we think, especially when we come back to thinking of this from a policy point of view, is how important is digital, and within that, how important is digital platforms within the overall scope of economic activity and regulatory, the surface of regulation. So that's the first point. A second point would be the barriers to doing business in developing countries, generally speaking, are much higher than they are in high-income countries. So everything is just generally speaking more difficult to do and more expensive to do in a developing country. It's managing your supply chain, accessing your suppliers, getting credit on the supply side, customers getting credit, and understanding your customers' creditworthy. All of that is more difficult to do in developing countries than it is in high-income countries. And so the role of digital platforms coming into those economies is actually, while you can argue that it's plugging gaps in, and it's disrupting markets in rich countries, it's doing that to a greater extent in developing countries, because it's providing alternative ways of operating as a business and operating as a consumer or as a household, where the substitutes are, or substituting for less effective transactions. So that's a second area in which developing countries are different. A third one is the digital markets and digital platforms, on the supply side, the industry structure looks quite different from what it is in developing, in rich countries. You don't get this extreme dominance market positions, market shares, let me say, in developing countries. You tend not to. So you'll see a multiplicity of e-commerce companies. You'll see lots of different ride-hailing companies and all the rest of it. You do see Facebook is one of the big social media platforms, but there are others as well. So the market structure in many developing countries looks quite different. And then there are some cases where it looks dramatically different in particular segments. So if you look at Russia, you look at the role of Yandex, you look at India, you look at China, you see very large big tech companies, which are, names you wouldn't recognize in the US and Europe. So that's another reason in which it's different. The fourth one would be the role of informality. So now informal employment, informal businesses, informal employment arrangements, and informal consumer activity is a very prominent feature of developing countries. In sub-Saharan Africa, 89% of people who are working are employed in informal businesses. So that's where they don't have a contract, they're not regulated in any way. This is not even necessarily certainly not a company, a formalized company. So in that context, when digital platforms come in, I'm thinking here about transaction platforms, either e-commerce or transport type platforms, or those types of platforms. You are introducing a degree of formality, or they're introducing a degree of formality into a market which is completely unregulated and completely informal. Now, if we contrast that with the situation in a developed country, which is actually where the opposite direction of travel is taking place. So take the public transport market, for example. Most countries, that's highly regulated, or pre-Uber and pre-transport riding hailing apps, it was completely regulated. And then those platforms come in, and there are degrees there are variation in degrees to which those ride-hailing businesses are regulated. But loosely speaking, that gig economy is less tightly regulated than what preceded it. So you've got the effect on formality and formalization and all the things that flow from that is actually moving in the opposite directions in rich countries versus developing countries. And then a final feature of platforms in many developing countries is actually perversely a strong dependence in some particular types of platform. And then the best example of this is payments, where you see in many, certainly not all, but in many developing countries, the payments, digital payments, usually off the back of mobile phone networks, has become the predominant way of moving money within countries. That's consumer to consumer and consumer to business and vice versa, and government to consumer as well. And so, in a sense, there are particular examples of platforms which play a hugely important role in society in a way which is not the case in developed countries. So to sum up all of that, the landscape of digital platforms in developing countries looks quite different, and the context which they're operating in and the role that they play is quite different in many developing countries. So that brings me on to my final area to talk about, which is, okay, well, if the landscape looks different and the context looks different, should the policy responses be different? And I think, and like I said, most developing countries have not actually done anything on this yet. So this is my thinking in advance. I can't really refer to many countries which have made decisions on it, but I think the overall point is that the balance between risks of economic, market power and the things that flow from that, and consumer and other types of harm that flow from that, versus the benefits to individual consumers and to the economy as a whole, that balance between risks and benefits is potentially different in many developing countries compared with what you see in high-income countries. So I'm just going to go into that in a little more detail, some particular aspects of it. One aspect of this is the role of those platforms in the broader economy, and I'll take an example of e-commerce. If you look at the size of the e-commerce market, the domestic e-commerce market in many developing countries compared with the overall commerce in that particular segment, say retail, for example, consumer retail, for example, the proportion of e-commerce in the overall retail consumer market is much smaller. So there's a much more competitive constraint on an e-commerce platform in a developing country from all those outside options than there would be if you take obviously the case of Amazon in the US or in Europe. So that competitive environment for those digital platforms is constrained by the fact that they're a much smaller part of the overall market. And actually, if you look at what consumers are using digital for in most developing countries, it's actually predominantly social media, and much less on e-commerce and other types of things, with the exception of payments, which I mentioned. And on the social media, a significant difference between social media market and between developing countries and richer countries is that the digital advertising market is much smaller. I mean, there are many global digital platforms which make little or no money from digital advertising in developing countries. And that's because that market just essentially doesn't really exist, or it's an extremely early stage of development. So the key feature of both, well, certainly Google and Facebook, if we look at the UK, but this is more broadly across Europe and the US, the key feature of those markets, which drives a lot of the regulatory attention on the antitrust side, which is the dominance in digital market, digital advertising, is not a feature of the market in developing countries. And then just a couple of other points, which is putting aside the economic and the market size of this, if we look at the institutions that are available potentially to regulate the digital platforms, well, in most countries, not all of them, but most countries, the overall institutional capacity to do anything about regulating business is weaker. Now, they have, got a grip in all cases on the telecoms market through the licensing process, which has given them a natural legal and legislative leverage over those operators. But those are all domestically licensed and domestically operated businesses. They're registered and taxed locally, and they have physical assets and financial assets locally. But of course, when we look at digital platforms, that's not the case. I mean, one basic point to make is some of the big tech platforms are much bigger than entire developing country economies. So there's a huge imbalance in just financial and economic weight between the platforms on one side and some countries on the other. Regulatory institutions are generally weaker. I mean, we can see the amount of effort and thought that has gone in just into the primary legislation in Europe and the UK and other countries. That's even before you actually start making regulatory decisions. And most developing countries don't have that kind of regulatory firepower. And the final point is that if we look at the body of regulation around digital platforms, it's not just antitrust or, in the case of proposed ex-ante regulation, there's also a body of consumer regulation, data protection regulation, and other types of regulatory instruments which do bind on these businesses already. And now in many developing countries, that kind of regulation doesn't either exist, or if it does exist, it's not enforced. So to sum up, developing countries and all the institutions that are working with developing countries are spending a lot of time looking at what's going on in the Europe and US, and developing countries are doing that with a view to potentially developing similar types of regulatory approaches. But I think as that process unfolds, we should all be mindful that, a kind of copy and paste job which worked on telecoms, may well not be appropriate in those countries for digital platforms. Steve, over to you.
So that's great, Mark. Thanks very much for that overview of the rest of the world. Congratulations for managing to cover that. So look, I have a couple of questions now that I wanted to put to the various panel members. And I'd like to start by exploring, I think, one of the tensions that's inherent in any attempt to regulate digital platforms, which is essentially the tension between a desire to introduce competition and the desire to protect innovation. I recall from my own background as a telecoms regulator, we always struggled with a similar tension between, on the one hand, desperately wanting to encourage competition in the market, faced with markets that are dominated by, in Europe, ex-state-owned incumbents. On the other hand, we always wanted those incumbents to invest vast amounts of money in new fibre networks, new mobile networks, and innovate in relation to the way they operate those networks. So there's always been that tension between regulating people to create competition, but also expecting those regulated firms to invest and innovate. So in the context of the debate about digital, I'd love to hear from our panel members how they think practically we can manage that tension as we design a new regulatory framework for digital platforms. How do we make sure that companies such as Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Apple continue to innovate at the same time as we regulate them? And perhaps I might start with Gerard, go through people in the same order as I started with.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. That's a very good question. It's a question that almost pops up in every panel I'm participating in. So I've thought about this. And I think also, Rob, I mean, it's always interesting on the panel to have people who come from different directions. And I thought, well, Rob definitely doesn't yet buy into the problem analysis. I've got a lot of time and respect for Rob, but I think on this one, he's got it wrong. Just to be very frank. I mean, if you don't like Tesco, you go to Sainsbury's, no? If you don't like Daimler, you go to Audi or you buy a BMW. If you're a supplier, you're a small business and you want to reach your customers, can you go to anybody else than Amazon if you are a marketplace? And no, it's not the same. And you were saying, look, fintech has been such a success, and it has been in Europe. And why is that? Because we've got an open banking directive. Because we implemented PSD2, the Payment Services Directive. Ask the banks what they think about it. They hate it. And it opened up to all these opportunities for competition. So, I mean, to say here's regulation and there's innovation, and they are kind of by definition in a contest, not at all. I think one of the colleagues, Andrea also made the point that legal predictability is very important. We have in Europe, we always have this internal market, and if we don't say put a rule, and I think you have it in the US too with the kind of the federal states, if you're not careful, I mean, the member states will regulate in very different ways, and it makes doing business much more costly. So here, I think we've kind of come to the conclusion, and that's just, I mean, that's in Europe, and I was a bit surprised by what Rob said, because I'm also working very closely with the US. I mean, we have the Trade and Technology Council at the moment, and one of the working groups is on technology platforms. And I mean, we may differ, and I fully agree what Rob said, that in the likelihood of similar legislation passing in the US is probably as likely as it will now snow in the next hour here in Belgium, which is not going to happen. But the problem analysis, and also there's books, I mean, of kind of academics, Nobel Prize winners who have kind of demonstrated that the platform economy does a lot of good, but there's also problems, which also our competition policy enforcement have brought to light. I mean, self-preferencing, yeah, it's fine to compete and beat your competition. We don't think it's so honest to compete by using the data that you collect from somebody who is hosted on your platform and to undercut him. It'd be the same if Ford would be competing with data it has stolen from General Motors. That's not fair. I mean, that's not what we think competition should be about. So yes, use your competitive strength and try to win market share, but not by exploiting data that frankly you are denying access to for the company that is like generating that data on your platform. A lot of, I mean, if you're in the media or press, I mean, a lot of subscriptions obviously are now are done through the App Store. If you are a media company in Europe, you don't know who your customers are, because Apple doesn't tell you who has kind of concluded a contract through the App Store to have access to your virtual, to your digital newspaper or your digital kind of magazine. And at the same time, of course, they can compete with you. I mean, the App Store, kind of Apple Music, not 30%. Spotify being kind of, you go through the App Store, 30% or 15%. Yeah, I mean, I think we all, I mean, I'm a great sports fan. I mean, so we all love competition, but you don't win a gold medal at Olympic Games by tripping up your fellow athletes, by saying, look, I won, and all the others are kind of down with their faces on the floor. So I think that's the problem analysis. I mean, we are not afraid that this will, I mean, actually the platform economy is not as innovative as it could be. I mean, the fact that these companies are kind of so powerful actually makes them lazy. Why would they innovate as much as they used to do to get into the position where they are now, when they are not threatened? I mean, we want competitive markets. The fact that we now open up opportunities for others to come in and compete should make these markets more innovative. We are not convinced that we are convinced that these markets could be more innovative. And they are not, because of this stronghold that these companies have on these markets, and they don't feel any pressure to innovate. And yes, of course, they want to maximize their profits, but they don't have to innovate because somebody is breathing down their necks. So how can we do all of that? And that's the question. Then it's an assessment, etc. But maybe the difference is is that in Europe, the problem analysis, I mean, there's any discussion about that. There's a problem, and the competition policy falls short. It takes too long, 6-7 years for Google Shopping. I mean, it's far too long.
So Gerard, can I just push you slightly? So let's accept, so personally, I am not where Rob is. I would accept there is a need probably for some form of regulation. But I definitely worry about the unintended consequences of that regulation. So, for example, if we end up with complex interoperability remedies mandated through regulation, you know, there are risks for regulation as well. So I just wondered if you could, perhaps briefly, because I need to go to the rest of the panel, but accepting that there is a case for regulation for now, how do you make sure that it is proportionate, targeted, doesn't hold back innovation?
Yeah. I mean, we do have these ex ante obligations. So there is no discussion like, okay, should we do this or not do this? So the question is very much how to do this. And this is where, like, I mean, I know Rob doesn't like the term, but I'm going to use it anyway. This is gatekeepers. This is where because that's also the legal term which we use. It isn't just a kind of an internal kind of reference that we use. If there's an obligation to give access to data, of course, there's then a question like what data, under which conditions, which is the API that you need to use, for how long should the data be accessible, etc. What about GDPR? By the way, we have also very stringent data protection requirements here. This is where the gatekeeper will kind of make a proposal and enter into a dialogue with the regulator. And of course, subject to some market testing, say this is a reasonable way of complying with that obligation. So that's where the opportunity arises to avoid that we over-regulate, and that could be these unintended consequences. I mean, I don't think there'll be unintended consequences, but there's a lot of intended consequences. And what we want to avoid is, because there's the occasional unintended consequence, we miss out on all the intended consequences. So I'd rather like to talk about the intended consequences than the occasional kind of risk of an unintended consequence, but I think we can manage that.
No, that's fine. Let me move to Will, because I suppose I'm to a certain extent trying to find some common ground, if I can, on the basis I think we all, or at least most of us, don't want unfair competition. There's a debate about how we define that. I think we all recognise the importance of innovation and want to protect that. So if I could ask Will how he sees that balance, not trying to debate the black and white question of whether there should be regulation, but how does one design it in detail to ensure that this is both effective but doesn't stifle innovation? So Will?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. And I also appreciated Rob's comments, but I fear we're not quite destined to see eye to eye. I mean, I don't think anyone would argue that the big firms spend a lot on R&D, or that they do indeed produce many good products and services. And by the way, sorry, as a side note, some parts of Tesco's trading arrangements in the UK are indeed regulated, precisely for the reasons that they have a strong bargaining position in some circumstances. And I mean, I agree on prioritising consumer welfare, but here we take a slightly broader view of consumer welfare to try and pick up dynamic competition and innovation. And I guess the key point, I mean, there's definitely common ground between myself and what Gerard has just said. The key point here is that real innovation is driven by competition. It's not driven by monopoly or by market power. In markets where you've got entrenched firms, innovation from two sources is reduced. If the prospects of competing successfully against the big players are small, that reduces competitors' incentive and ability to innovate. And the big players themselves will feel less competitive pressure, so that they themselves innovate less, the breathing down the neck point that Gerard made so well. And it's not even just about the quantity of innovation, it's about the direction of innovation. In markets with very powerful firms, where others innovate, they're more likely to develop complements to the biggest firm's products and services in the knowledge that they can't compete directly, rather than fronting up directly to those firms. So for us, I mean, this whole framework is about supporting innovation by making markets more contestable. We want the situation where the top firm in a market can be knocked off its perch by a better proposition. And indeed, to that end, we proposed a specific innovation objective for the Digital Markets Unit. And we think the main way to do this is to be highly proportionate and targeted. So I mean, there's no real sort of magic answer to your question, Steve. But to identify where strategic market status exists and design a carefully targeted combination of code of conduct and pro-competitive interventions that is tailored to the problems we identify. And to do that in the participative fashion that I described, through which the companies concerned on all sides can help us understand how best to do that and establish the rules so that innovation by all types of firms is supported. And I would see the potential for the right kinds of pro-competitive interventions to be, if you like, a part of the infrastructure that supports innovation. Gerard beat me to the punch in mentioning open banking, but Rob, having mentioned fintech and the success of that sector and its vibrancy, certainly in the UK and I know in Europe as well, open banking, a regulatory intervention originating in the CMA, I should add, has been a key part of the infrastructure that supported that sector, as others have taken advantage of the managed levels of data access that's involved. And just a couple of final notes. I mean, to your parallel, Steve, with telecoms, I'm not quite sure it's perfect. Telecoms regulation often involves weighing up incumbents investing huge fixed costs in new networks versus opening up that access to others, or weighing up investment competition versus access-based competition. And I don't think we see quite those same parallels here. And yes, if we were designing an interoperability remedy or indeed any other kind of remedy, we would definitely need to be cognizant of innovation. But interoperability or indeed other types of intervention don't mean commoditization or harmonization. So again, as Gerald, yes, there are risks and unintended consequences to keep in mind, but I wouldn't want to avoid seeking out the benefits on the basis of those.
Okay, thanks, Will. Let me go to Rob. And by the way, can I emphasize, I'm not suggesting we don't seek out the benefits of regulation. I spent 20 years as a regulator. I still have some scars from failed regulation. It hasn't always worked. But anyway, over to Rob.
Yeah, the '96 Telecom Act was a huge success.
Yes, yeah, good point.
He said sarcastically. First of all, I enjoy discussing with Gerard and Will. I really absolutely enjoy it. I want to make clear two things are going on. One is we love the open banking rules of the UK and Europe, and we're pushing for them here. So it's not as if somehow we're like libertarians. That to me is a good part of regulation, because you're basically preventing somebody, in this case, big banks, from giving customers really the access to the data. So I totally agree with that. And we're for data portability and data sharing. And secondly, Gerard, I know it may be sounding, because I know Americans, it's kind of like y'all think we're libertarian crazy people, but if I were to go down the list of the DMA, and there's multiple, I don't know how many, let's say 20 provisions. There's some in there that I agree with. I'm not at all saying, all 20, scrap them. No, there's some in there that I think make sense and are addressing a real problem, but there are other ones that I don't. And I think having a dialogue about that is a useful thing. Thirdly, I think the real question, which to me has been very confused in this debate, is, are we talking about competition for the platform or competition on the platform? And they're very different. I actually don't really care whether, government breaks up Facebook into Facebook and Headbook. Actually, sorry, I do care, because I don't want to have to post 2 times. What a pain in the rear that would be. But you think about, what are these companies really competing for? And it goes to market definition. They're competing for eyeballs. So nobody expected TikTok. TikTok is a direct competitor to Facebook. Now, if you say, well, but it's not social media. Well, that would only matter if they were pricing that. If we had to pay for social media, then yeah, I would get that. They're charging a big price premium and rent seeking for the price they're charging consumers for social media, but it's free, so we don't worry about it. The competition there is really for advertisers and for eyeballs, and all of the platforms are in intense competition. If it's competition on the platform, again, I think certain rules to prevent really anti-competitive behavior, I think, are very appropriate. But again, we just have to disagree, I guess. I don't, you know, I don't think if Amazon knows that, you know, batteries are selling really well and they start their own Amazon battery brand, the only benefit of that is to consumers. And yeah, I get the battery company might be a little hurt, but I guess it comes down to a core set of values. Do you care about the battery company more than you care about the consumer? I don't care about the battery company, frankly. I care about the consumer. So.
Thanks, Rob. Interesting set of different perspectives, which is what I was hoping for, by the way. So that's fine. Andrea, can I pass over to you?
Yes, I do agree with both sides to some degree. I can see how competitors drive better innovation. But I think one thing that it's sometimes overlooked, and it comes from the unintended consequences, I would say, is the fact that these firms also compete because they want to appropriate value. They want to create something new, and then they want a share of that for themselves, and that can then be reused for innovation or for sharing with the stakeholders. And in the design of intervention frameworks, this appropriability ability of the platforms should be acknowledged, because without it, the platforms will change their strategies for innovation. And if they are not able to monetize what they are doing in one way or another, then this will have consequences on the services that they offer to users. And this is particularly relevant when we're talking about platforms that are part of an ecosystem. Quite a few of these services are monetizing through advertisement, which means we get access to a service without paying, but in return, we're receiving adverts through another channel. But it's the same company that is able to internalize this and cross-subsidize the initial services. If that link is broken and they're not able to appropriate value, then there might be a change in the way they innovate. So that's one thing that should be kept in mind when designing this framework. And it does matter to think of what could be the unintended consequences.
Thanks so much, Andrea. And now over to Mark. Got a couple of minutes really before we finish.
Yeah, well, just two very quick points. I mean, if you want to see innovation in the digital platform space, then developing countries is a place to look. I mean, there is a furious competition, and you know that is a competition for the market as much as, you know, a share of the market. Because the prize is so high, as they've seen in you know, richer countries where the big tech platforms have become so large, that there is a very intense competition, you know, and that competition is in innovation, right? It's innovation in services and so on. And that's not because there's no regulation, it's because it's the early stages of evolution of the market. But I think it's quite instructive. The other point was just on this analogy with telecoms. I mean, I think there are, Will's right, I mean, there are limits to this, how useful a comparison it is, but there is another aspect of telecoms regulation which I think is quite instructive, which was interoperability. So when we moved from monopolies to competition, one of the absolutely founding pieces of regulation was that networks should be able to, you should be able to call from one network to another. Now that had the effect of allowing competition essentially upstream amongst networks, but it eliminated competition through innovation of the service. So a telephone call has looked the same, sounded the same for nearly 100 years. And it was the first time that changed was when you got VoIP. So when, you know, WhatsApp, you could start calling over WhatsApp and all the other competitors, you started hearing a different quality in the sound. So you begin to get innovation in the service as well as in the upstream infrastructure. And I think there's an instructive lesson there, which is when we're thinking about those targeted regulations, it's you know, the point that was made earlier, which is, are we targeting that at competition for the platform, at the platform level or at the downstream level? And are we sure that the regulation that we're imposing, especially if it's an interoperability type regulation, are we sure it's going to enhance competition, or where is it going to enhance competition and where is it going to soften competition in innovation?
Okay, so thanks very much, Mark. We're out of time, so I don't have time to ask my other questions. I found it a fascinating discussion, particularly because, you know, frankly, the fact that there are differences is what makes it interesting. I have this slightly idealistic idea that we might be able over time to find common ground. I haven't given up on that, but we've clearly got a bit of a journey to go on. Thank my speakers for helping me with that journey.